The billionaire froze so completely that for several seconds she forgot how to breathe. Across the crowded charity hospital courtyard, her 8-year-old daughter, a child who had refused to sleep against anyone since the accident that changed their lives, was peacefully asleep with her cheek resting on the shoulder of a stranger. The stranger was a single father wearing a faded work jacket, his rough hand resting protectively near the little girl without moving her even an inch. But what stopped the billionaire's heart was not the sight of her daughter sleeping. It was the moment the man's sleeve shifted, exposing an old, weathered tattoo on his upper arm, a tattoo she recognized from a photograph connected to a military tragedy years ago. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can continue bringing you stories that remind us that compassion can appear in the most unexpected places. Celeste Whitmore had spent 11 years building an empire because she had learned early that money could solve almost every problem except the ones that mattered most. At 39, she controlled a global luxury architecture company, owned homes in 3 countries, and could make a phone call that moved millions of dollars before lunch. Newspapers called her brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to intimidate. But none of those descriptions mattered when it came to her daughter, Maren. The little girl had once been bright, energetic, and endlessly curious, the kind of child who collected smooth stones and insisted that every stray animal deserved a name. Then a car accident took Celeste's husband and left Maren with injuries that healed physically but changed something inside her. She became withdrawn, frightened by crowds, uncomfortable around unfamiliar people, and almost incapable of sleeping unless Celeste was beside her. Doctors called it trauma. Therapists called it anxiety. Celeste simply called it the worst thing that had ever happened to her child. That afternoon, Celeste had brought Maren to a pediatric rehabilitation center where the little girl was participating in an art therapy program. Celeste had planned to stay only an hour before returning to a business meeting, but when she walked into the courtyard, she noticed something strange. Maren was sitting beneath a broad maple tree beside a man Celeste had never seen before. The man looked completely out of place among the wealthy parents, doctors, and polished visitors. His boots were worn, his jeans carried traces of construction dust, and his dark brown jacket had clearly seen better years. Yet Maren looked completely comfortable beside him. More astonishingly, she had fallen asleep against his shoulder. Celeste stopped several yards away, her entire body becoming rigid with fear. Her first instinct was anger. Her second was panic. She hurried toward them, prepared to pull her daughter away, but then she saw the man's face. He was not taking advantage of the situation. He was barely breathing, as though he were afraid the smallest movement might wake the child. The man noticed Celeste approaching and slowly looked up. His eyes were calm but tired, carrying the unmistakable weight of someone who had spent years fighting battles no one else could see. He carefully adjusted his posture so Maren's head remained supported, then gently moved a fallen strand of hair away from her face. Celeste reached them and immediately checked her daughter's breathing. Maren remained asleep. For a moment, Celeste could not understand what she was seeing. Her daughter had not slept peacefully around a stranger in years. The man quietly explained that he had been waiting for his own son after an appointment in the building when Maren had dropped a handful of colored pencils. He had helped gather them. She had started talking about the picture she was drawing, and somehow, after nearly 20 minutes, she had fallen asleep beside him. Celeste wanted to thank him, but suspicion still battled with disbelief. She gently touched Maren's shoulder, and the little girl stirred but did not wake. The stranger remained perfectly still. Celeste finally asked his name, and he introduced himself as Everett Callahan. He was 38, a widowed single father raising a 10-year-old son named Rowan. He worked as a maintenance contractor for several local buildings and occasionally volunteered at the rehabilitation center because his son received occupational therapy there. Nothing about his explanation sounded unusual. Yet Celeste noticed something when Everett shifted his arm. His jacket sleeve pulled upward, exposing a small portion of black ink on his upper arm. Celeste's eyes locked onto it. A faded eagle. 3 stars. And beneath them, the barely visible outline of a military insignia. Everett immediately pulled his sleeve down. Celeste stared at him with a strange mixture of confusion and recognition. Years earlier, during the memorial service for her husband's close friend, she had seen a photograph of a Navy SEAL team that had been involved in a classified rescue operation overseas. One member of that team had been reported missing after a mission went catastrophically wrong. The photograph had shown a young man with the same unusual tattoo. Celeste had never known his name, but she remembered the image because her husband had spoken about the bravery of those men with unusual respect. She asked Everett if he had served in the Navy. His expression changed. It was subtle, but Celeste saw it. For the first time, the calmness disappeared from his face. He looked down at Maren sleeping peacefully against him, then toward his son waiting near the entrance. Finally, he admitted that he had once been a Navy SEAL but had left the military years earlier. He did not offer details, and Celeste sensed immediately that the subject was painful. She also realized that the tattoo was not decorative. It was a piece of a life Everett had buried. Before Celeste could ask anything else, Maren woke. Instead of pulling away from Everett, she instinctively held onto his jacket. That simple movement devastated Celeste. Her daughter had spent years avoiding physical contact with nearly everyone except her mother. Yet she was holding on to this stranger as though she had known him forever. Everett looked just as surprised. He gently placed his hand over Maren's small fingers, and Celeste saw something in his eyes that frightened her more than the tattoo had. It was tenderness mixed with grief. Later that afternoon, Celeste learned why. Everett's wife, Laurel, had died 3 years earlier from complications following an emergency surgery. Everett had been deployed frequently during the early years of their marriage, and by the time he returned permanently, their son was barely old enough to remember him as anything other than a man in uniform. Everett had blamed himself for missing too many ordinary moments. He left the military because he could no longer bear the feeling that every important thing in his life was happening while he was somewhere else. But there was another reason. During his final deployment, Everett's team had rescued several civilians from a collapsed building. One of them had been a little girl. Everett had carried her through smoke and falling debris while his teammate, Nathan Mercer, stayed behind to search for another trapped child. Nathan never came out. Everett survived, but he had never forgiven himself for being the one who walked away. Celeste listened silently as he described the guilt that had followed him home. Then she realized something that made her chest tighten. Nathan Mercer had been her husband's closest friend. The connection between their lives suddenly became painfully clear. Years ago, Celeste had believed Nathan had died because of a failed military operation. She had never known the details. She had never known Everett had been there. She had never imagined that the quiet father sitting beneath a tree with her daughter was the man who had carried Nathan's final memories home. Celeste's first reaction was not gratitude. It was resentment. She remembered the grief of her husband, the memorial service, the unanswered questions, the years of watching Maren grow up without her father. Part of her wanted to blame Everett for surviving when Nathan had not. It was irrational, but grief rarely follows reason. She told Everett she needed distance. He accepted it without argument. He stood carefully, allowing Maren to rise on her own, and thanked Celeste for trusting him enough to let her daughter rest. Then he walked toward the entrance with his son. Maren watched him leave. For the first time in years, Celeste saw disappointment in her daughter's eyes. That evening did not become dark or dramatic because the most important battle was happening in daylight, inside Celeste herself. She sat in her office surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city and opened an old box she had avoided for years. Inside were photographs belonging to her late husband. She found the military photograph she remembered. Her hands trembled when she turned it over and found a handwritten note. The note had been written by her husband. It said that Nathan had once told him about a SEAL named Everett Callahan, a man who had saved 3 civilians during a dangerous operation and nearly died doing it. Nathan had described Everett as the kind of man who would carry another person's pain as though it were his own. Celeste read the words twice. Then she cried. Not because Everett had been responsible for Nathan's death. Because she realized he had been carrying the same grief she had been carrying, only from the other side. The next afternoon, Celeste returned to the rehabilitation center. Everett was outside helping repair a broken wooden bench while Rowan worked nearby on a school project. Maren saw him before Celeste did. She ran toward him, then stopped herself several feet away, uncertain whether she was allowed to approach. Everett smiled. Maren stepped closer. Celeste watched her daughter place one small hand into Everett's. That moment changed everything. Celeste apologized for judging him. Everett accepted the apology, but he admitted that he understood because he had spent years judging himself even more harshly. Celeste finally asked him what had happened to Nathan, and Everett told her the truth. Nathan had not died because Everett abandoned him. Nathan had stayed behind willingly to save a trapped family. His final decision had saved 2 lives. Everett had carried the guilt because accepting the truth meant accepting that sometimes heroes did everything right and still lost. Celeste broke down. For years, she had imagined Nathan's death as a meaningless tragedy. Now she understood that his final act had been one of courage. Everett had not taken someone from her family. He had brought someone home as far as he possibly could. Maren eventually became the bridge neither adult knew they needed. She began spending afternoons with Everett and Rowan at the rehabilitation center. Rowan taught her how to build small wooden models, while Maren taught him how to draw animals. Everett never treated Maren as fragile. He encouraged her to try, fail, laugh, and try again. Celeste noticed that her daughter slowly began sleeping more peacefully, speaking more openly, and looking toward the future instead of constantly looking backward. But Everett still struggled. He had built his entire identity around surviving, providing, and protecting. He did not know how to receive kindness. When Celeste offered him a better job managing a charitable foundation connected to her company, he initially refused. He believed accepting help meant weakness. Celeste told him that perhaps after spending years protecting everyone else, he deserved the chance to let someone stand beside him. That sentence stayed with him. Everett eventually accepted the position, not because of the money but because the foundation supported wounded veterans, single parents, and children recovering from trauma. For the first time since leaving the military, he found a purpose that did not require him to carry a weapon or pretend he was unbreakable. Celeste changed too. She had spent years believing that being strong meant controlling everything. Everett taught her that strength could also mean admitting fear. Maren taught her that healing could happen through trust. Rowan taught her that family was not always created by blood. And Everett learned that surviving a tragedy did not mean he had to spend the rest of his life being punished by it. Months later, the rehabilitation center held a small daytime garden ceremony to celebrate children who had completed their therapy programs. Maren stood beside Celeste wearing a simple blue dress, while Everett stood nearby with Rowan. When the director announced that Maren had created a painting representing hope, she walked to the front carrying a canvas. The painting showed 4 figures beneath a tree. A mother. A little girl. A father. And a boy. Above them was a bright morning sky. Celeste looked at Everett, and he looked back at her. Neither needed to explain what the painting meant. It was not a promise that pain would disappear. It was a promise that pain did not have to decide the future. Years later, Celeste would still remember the exact afternoon when she first saw her daughter sleeping on a stranger's shoulder. She would remember the worn jacket, the quiet courtyard, the faded seal tattoo, and the fear that had nearly made her turn away from the man who would eventually become one of the most important people in their lives. She had once believed the tattoo represented war. Now she understood that it represented survival. It reminded her that some people carry scars beneath their sleeves, some carry them in their hearts, and some carry them so quietly that the world never notices. But sometimes, one act of kindness allows those hidden wounds to finally breathe. Maren had not needed Everett because he was a former SEAL. She needed him because he was patient. Everett had not needed Celeste because she was a billionaire. He needed her because she was willing to forgive. And Celeste had not needed another powerful person in her life. She needed someone who could remind her that love was not about controlling what happened next. It was about having the courage to trust again. Just before the ceremony ended, Maren reached for Everett's hand and then reached for Celeste's. The three of them stood together while Rowan joined them, and for one quiet moment, the family they had never planned seemed completely natural. If this story touched your heart, please leave a meaningful comment and tell us what you believe the lesson is. Is true strength about surviving pain, or is it about finding the courage to trust and love again? Share your thoughts with our community, because someone reading your words today may be carrying a burden they have never told anyone about. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the person we almost judge is the person who has been fighting the hardest battle, and sometimes the greatest second chance begins with something as simple as letting someone rest their head on your shoulder.